Look, I was wrong about Rise of the Ronin. Pre-release, I wasn't convinced that Team Ninja's open-world samurai tale was gonna be as good as we all wanted it to be. I thought it looked a little derivative, a little unpolished, and a little bit too clunky for its own good. And while the end result isn't perfect by any means, I am big enough to throw up my hands and say, look, I was wrong. This game rules. Sadly, it does take a little while to get going though. The opening tutorial levels actually give the bad impression that Team Ninja has just delivered another Wo Long or Neo, but with watered down combat as players are ushered through discrete levels and boss fights that harken back to the structure of the studio's other releases. After creating 2 custom characters, a samurai duo referred to as the Veiled Edge, the opening missions slowly introduce the core mechanics. And like I said, most of these won't be unfamiliar to long-time Team Ninja fans. You have your checkpoint bonfires, known here as Veiled Edge banners, which allow you to bank XP and heal, but respawn all basic enemies. You have a selection of weapons and classes to choose from, you have tough enemies that require an understanding of their attack patterns and the smart use of your own stamina meter to beat, and you even have a parry mechanic, here called the Counter-Spark system, that would be familiar to Wo Long players. And it's not that any of this is bad, of course, it's just worth noting that it takes a couple of hours for Rise of the Ronin to play its true hand, once the title card drops, once you lock in one of the playable characters, and once it gives you free reign to its open world. And what an open world that is! This is a big PS5 exclusive, and from a technical perspective, it appears to be nowhere near the level of even a PS4 exclusive like Ghost of Tsushima. And that's not entirely untrue either. Team Ninja is not a first-party studio, and graphically, yeah, you wouldn't hold this up next to your Horizons or your God of Wars, but it is a nice evolution from previous Team Ninja titles and a good-looking game in its own right. Now, I'm not, and certainly never will be, as talented as the people from Digital Foundry, but to my eye, I found the graphics mode and the ray tracing mode that the game launched with a little bit too jittery, especially the ray tracing mode, but playing on performance for the majority of my time, that was stable and it was smooth and it was not even that much of a visual hit, again, to my eyes. But away from the technical side of things, it's often art direction that defines whether or not a game looks good, and the art direction for Rise of the Ronin, it hits the spot. Whether you're gazing out at the sunrise on a beachfront or scaling a mountain to look over the world below, Rise of the Ronin has plenty of picturesque moments that encourage you to just stop and breathe it all in. From the detail on the outfits and weapons to the surprisingly extensive and expressive character customization options, there are so many areas where the game visually looks like the real deal. Yes, you will see a lot of repeated interiors and enemies, notice texture pop in, especially when you're using the glider, and the occasional skybox that's, all in all, a little bit ropey. But the criticism of this apparently looking like a PS3 game, that's just something I can't understand. The aesthetic is spot on, and while no, it's not technically the most impressive game on the platform, it's clear that the developers have prioritized the feel of gameplay over pouring money and resources into the presentation. And even then, the presentation looks pretty damn good. It's that core game feel that makes Rise of the Ronin's shortcomings feel a little bit inconsequential though. As mentioned, the gameplay will be familiar to anyone who has played a previous Team Ninja title, but here the focus is way more on player expression, freedom, and accessibility. The studio has made it clear that they're attempting to garner a broader audience with this game, and that means while still cribbing from Software-style Souls features, Rise of the Ronin is much closer to Star Wars Jedi Survivor than it is Lies of P. I mean, the introduction of difficulty levels in and of themselves completely changes the gaming experience. If you're here for a classic Team Ninja experience, you can come close, but if you want to just go nuts and chop off arms and heads on easy mode, well, the game doesn't restrict that thrill. I personally played the majority of the game on the highest difficulty mode, and while there was still a lot of challenge in there, I must admit it doesn't come close to the punishing heights of something like Neo or even a Wo Long. So if you're a hardcore Team Ninja fan and you're looking for another one of those experiences, it's not quite on that level, but obviously intentionally so. Again, I don't think that's a bad thing here, and there were still plenty of bosses, especially in the late game, that beat my ass into the ground, but it is worth noting if you're coming in with those more hardcore expectations. Part of what makes the combat and gameplay itself so enjoyable, though, is that there's so much more depth to Rise of the Ronin's mechanics than may initially appear. While the focus is on performing combos with square and deflecting enemy attacks with triangle to open them up for a finishing move, you also need to take fighting styles into consideration. Similar to Ghost of Tsushima, every weapon in Rise of the Ronin comes with a whole host of unlockable combat styles, each with unique sets of animations and special moves, some of which may or may not harken back to the combat styles featured in other Team Ninja games, but well, I'll let you discover them for yourself. More than just offering variety in player expression though, swapping to the right style for the right opponent, signified by a blue marker above their health bar if you have the advantage or a red one if you're at a disadvantage, is essential in making the most out of your attacks. While you can still kill enemies with any stance, you'll be rewarded with better damage for paying attention to their fighting style and altering your tactics accordingly. With these styles unlocked by beating specific enemies and leveling up weapons, it means that while there aren't a whole host of weapon types in Rise of the Ronin, the way a katana feels in Hour 1 can be completely different by Hour 40, and there's a real joy to mastering each implement of death. Even seemingly small things like the ability to convert the blood on your blade to a stamina boost by a smartly timed tap of R1, think Gears of War's tactical reload, imbues the combat with more tactical depth. There's also a huge emphasis on movement and agility in the combat and gameplay as well. Players are encouraged to run across rooftops, strike with hidden assassinations, traverse the world via mounts, and launch themselves off the highest peaks to glide to their next destination. It just feels great to blow someone's head off with a rifle, leap from a building, and instantly assassinate 2 enemies below before engaging the boss one-on-one. That gameplay loop, doesn't get old. Immediacy has taken priority here when it comes to every element of the design, and that makes for a kinetic, frenetic, always fast-paced action game. And like Elden Ring's approach to difficulty, some of the challenge in Rise of the Ronin can be circumvented just by nature of this being an open-world game. Rise of the Ronin showers you with loot gained from completing side missions and activities like liberating bandit camps. Both aesthetically and mechanically, new weapons and gear always serve as welcome rewards, and mean if you come against a challenge that's proving too much, you have the chance to explore and come back stronger with better gear. Likewise, the game's Ronin missions, essentially the more linear main story quests, allow you to invite other players to help you in co-op or bring along 2 AI allies. If you opt for the latter option, it gives you the opportunity to control these characters directly, making use of their unique skills and allowing you to revive teammates and even continue the fight as long as one remains alive. However, while this can make for some exhilarating last-minute clutches against tough bosses, in tight spaces, the sheer amount of bodies on screen can become a touch overwhelming and disorientating, leading to a couple cheap hits or deaths. This mechanic is definitely better in the more wide-open spaces rather than the narrow corridors that have featured in other Team Ninja games that show up again here. Perhaps the one major thing that doesn't work, though, in Rise of the Ronin's attempt to transfer the core mechanics from previous Team Ninja games over to this one, is the approach to the bonfire system. Though these Veiled Edge banners work essentially the same as they always have, serving as a place to fast travel to, bank XP, and reset enemy encounters, the latter element rarely has any bearing on actual gameplay here. With regular checkpoints out in the open world, and sub-bosses and entire enemy encampments not respawning once you kill them, the implementation just feels a little inconsequential. The design of the sandbox means you'll rarely be returning to locations anyway, while the more linear Ronin missions are also usually forgiving with checkpoints, to the point where a bonfire run doesn't really factor into the gameplay loop. Even on hard, like I said. The streamlining of mechanics factors into Rise of the Ronin's character build and stat system as well. While not completely dropped from the Neo games, character building has been smoothed out to be more simplistic and immediate. You're still leveling up your character, but rather than pouring points into a bunch of specific attributes, there are only 4 this time around: strength, dexterity, intelligence, and charm. All of which I don't have in real life. Each of these comes with its own skill tree, and leveling up the numbers tied to each one depends on how many unlocks you have in each category. It's simple, but it works here to keep the focus on the action. Plus, character building and weapon scaling isn't lost entirely. Your stats dictate which weapon proficiencies are immediately available to you, and you can spec towards a certain attribute in order to boost the stats of associated weapons. Set during a turning point in Japanese history where the old way of the samurai is at odds with modern Western powers, Rise of the Ronin's setting is instantly enticing. While we have seen plenty depictions of feudal Japan in video games, Rise of the Ronin takes the Red Dead Redemption approach by setting the action right at the end of an era rather in the middle or the start of one. Consequently, the world of Rise is defined by transition. Cities mix conventional feudal Japan architecture with the more industrial buildings from London and America, and even the weapon selection is affected by this design. While wielding katanas in one hand, you can back up that combat style with ranged 6-shooters or even musket fire. It makes for a compelling tool set and selection of weapons and abilities, even if I am a little bit biased because I absolutely loved using the bayonet rifle. That thing was, being able to just stab a guy in the neck and then shoot his head off even though he's dead. I don't know, man, call me sick, but that was magnificent. Kudos to the animators. Your custom character's role in this story is to essentially shape the entire future of Japan through RPG missions and choices. These choices allow you to side with specific factions and create alliances that can result in characters living or dying and huge events either happening or not. On a smaller scale, this is accomplished by meeting people in the open world, taking on personal side quests, and clearing out repeated activities. The latter comprises your standard open world fare. The aforementioned bandit camps, shrines to pray at, bounties to find and kill, collectibles to find, and more cats than one person may ever truly need to pet. Though hey, I'm a dog guy. Don't kill me. And the thing is, despite these being repeated for literally the entirety of the game, a game that took me 60 hours to get through, and that includes all the main missions and about 90% of the side content, they actually genuinely never got that boring. Never got boring at all, in fact. The combat is just so engaging that an excuse to take on another bounty boss is always welcome, especially if it allows you to try out a new bit of loot or gain a little bit of weapon proficiency. The key to these activities as well is that they're just not too demanding of your time. Even the largest bandit camps in the late game with multiple sub-bosses will clock in at under 15 minutes in length, with most being beatable in a fraction of that time. Thanks to the breakneck pace, fluidity of the gameplay, and constant rewards, activities rarely ever feel in the moment as rote as they probably look on paper. And part of that is thanks to the game's bond system, whereby you're encouraged to complete quests for specific characters and speak to them in order to increase their affinity towards you, thus leading to better rewards and bespoke side missions. With the bond system sometimes being tied to the fates of certain characters, increasing your bond via these activities also alleviates the repetition. There's often then 3 or 4 reasons you want to take on an activity. It's never just about ticking an item off the map screen so it looks cleaner. The repetition, sadly, always can't be ignored though. In terms of enemy variety and sub-bosses, expect to see the same enemy types and designs over and over again. Though there's enough variety in terms of movesets and challenge, it's easy to feel deja vu when coming up to the end of a bandit camp and fighting another fist-bladed giant or hulking wrestler. The same can be said for the buildings you're raiding, whose familiarity do lend themselves to satisfying muscle memory, but reappear a few too many times across the 3 large, explorable city maps. And unfortunately, this repetition creeps into the main missions as well, not just the side content and the activities. While these do fare better by usually taking place in unique locales, don't expect anything too inventive in terms of mission objectives. In fact, the vast majority of the game can be boiled down to go here, kill that. Fortunately, the game admittedly does know that going there and killing that is incredibly satisfying, and it can get along just on that basis alone. It's just worth noting again, if you're coming in expecting intricate and detailed objectives, this isn't necessarily that game. This is way more about the action first and foremost, and that's fine by me, but after 60 hours and you're repeating the same thing over and over again, something worth knowing. The game also has an issue as it goes on with repeated boss battles. Be prepared to fight these same characters to cap off levels over and over again as Rise of the Ronin progresses, to the point where it almost feels like a little bit of a joke. Especially because these characters are often integral to the story, sometimes being allies and sometimes being enemies, their reappearances make them lose their luster. While this could have facilitated nice rivalries that made the ultimate besting of them all the more satisfying, it can become confusing as to why you're having a third battle with someone you were fighting alongside with just 2 missions ago. And that unfortunately brings us to the biggest issue with Rise of the Ronin, that being the story. In terms of setting, characters, and premise, there is a lot to like in here. As mentioned, the idea of forging a future for Japan is massively intriguing, and the characters you interact with on your journey are memorable and engaging, leading to some genuinely difficult faction choices and nice emotional twists if their stories are cut short. The main problem actually comes from the game's RPG structure. In theory, this should actually fit perfectly, but in practice, it feels a little bit too ambitious for its own good. Because the game doesn't want to lock you out of content, it means that you can play both sides of this conflict and create bonds with everyone, and that's fine early on, but as the final act stakes become increasingly colossal, it always feels a little bit incongruous to be aiding people whose men you were previously slaughtering in the hundreds, if not thousands. Like seriously, some of the stuff I've done to these guys, I would not be allowed in the room with their leaders. Likewise, when the hard choices do come, you can see the cogs of the script turning. Even if you manage to save a character, they'll be suspiciously absent moving forward, presumably because it would have taken too many resources to factor them into a proper branching story. Likewise, you can see the dialogue being stitched together to keep up in real time. Characters will speak as though someone is being killed, only to follow it up with, "But hey, I'm pleased they're on the mend though," as the only signifier of the choice you made. The scale of the story itself doesn't really help either. Taking place across years, huge events take place off-screen, and characters come and go from the story without much explanation. It's the kind of narrative that honestly made me feel a little bit dumb, and maybe that's because I am, and I'm really interested to see how other people get on with it, because at times it just felt like I was always missing a piece of the puzzle, like there was a bit of context that I didn't have for why these characters were acting the way they were, and why my protagonist was acting that way with them. Thankfully, the game does give you the option to go back and experience the different branches of its story without starting the entire thing again, and there is an extensive encyclopedia in the menu to fill you in on the finer details of character relationships and story beats, and especially that big timeline. But still, in the moment, and especially in some of the cutscenes, the storytelling feels a little bit fractured. Thankfully though, these side missions fare much, much better, and these were, by and large, absolutely amazing. The character-specific ones in particular will usually have you progressing the same narrative thread as the game progresses, serving as more compact and satisfying stories. And these were where Rise of the Ronin's story was allowed to shine and make the most of its premise. Whether you're helping characters embrace Western science in order to concoct a cure for tuberculosis, or trying to stop the spread of cholera brought to Japan by those very same Westerners, the vast majority of the side quests feature clearly defined arcs, enjoyable missions, and serve to flesh out characters in the way that the main story doesn't quite have time for, while impacting that main story in a really interesting way. Ultimately then, I think your mileage with Rise of the Ronin will vary depending on exactly what you want out of it. If you're someone looking for the most cutting-edge PS5 game on the market, you might find yourself wanting, because this is a game that undeniably lacks the technical sheen of modern AAA releases, relies on tried and tested formulas, gets bogged down by repetition, and has a story too ambitious for its own good. And yet, at the end of the day, I still really loved it. I still think it's an incredible game. The strength of its world, the absolutely incredible combat, and the bevy of content in there had me happily playing through 60 hours of this thing, trying to 100% complete it, and I easily could have done another 10 or 20. Hell, even as I've moved on to other games since putting this down, I'm still thinking about it, and I find myself booting up the game just for a hit of that combat and to run around a bit or ride around on my horse, plucking flowers. Rise of the Ronin is not a perfect game, but it is a goddamn satisfying one, and it's done more than enough to ensure that I, at least, will be there day one for the sequel. or give me some DLC. I would love some DLC. Right, that has been our incredibly long review of Rise of the Ronin. We will be talking more about this game, no doubt, on the podcasts moving forward, and already have been. If you want to go and subscribe there over on Spotify, Acast, Apple Music, or wherever the hell you get your podcasts, and hopefully we'll do some tips and tricks and more videos on this going forward. Let me know if you're looking forward to the game, if you've already played it and you think it's great or bad or could have done something better. I'm really interested because I've been in a real bubble with this one. Until then, though, thanks for watching. See you later.